Welcome to Bespoken Bones with your host, Pavini Moray, connecting ancestors, sex, magic and science. Pavini explores transpersonal tools for erotic wellness every new and full moon, engaging educators, healers, spiritual leaders and scientists in revolutionary dialogue. Get ready to feel good and go deep. This is Bespoken Bones.
Hi, and welcome to Bespoken Bones, Ancestors at the Crossroads of Sex, Magic, and Science. We're healing trauma, connecting with our roots, and developing radiant, erotic wellness in past, present, and future generations. And I'm your host, Pavini Moray. There's a couple of things before we start today's interview that I'm super excited about. So the first thing is that if you are interested in all of this ancestor stuff, which obviously you are, and you'd like to have more relationship with your queer and trans ancestors, you're invited to participate in my new class, which is simply called Queer and Trans Ancestors. So it's online for 5 weeks. There's 2 live video classes that bookend 3 one-on-one sessions with me. And during that process, you'll create and develop relationships with your loving, well and bright queer and trans ancestors, so that you can really fully receive the gift of their blessing. In my experience, developing that connection with these ones has really allowed me to feel a deeper sense of belonging in the world. So you can go to my website, which is trancestralhealing.com, and click on the Queer and Trans Ancestors class. And yeah, hope to see you there. And then the second thing, it's the full moon today. And if you happen to be in the San Francisco Bay Area and are listening to this on the Beltane full moon, would love to invite you to Exquisite Outcast, a ritual to tend the unloved dead of San Francisco, for the sake of greater cultural wellness. And so in community, we are gathering to tend the dead of San Francisco, the neglected dead, the queer dead, the trans outsiders, the sex workers, the victims of genocide, the Chinese indentured laborers, the AIDS dead. And so this is the second in a ritual series that was begun at Sha'can last year, and you are welcome to attend. No matter if you've attended the one in the at Sha'can or not, the ritual is free to attend, and it's today, Sunday, April 29th, from 4 to 6 p.m., and it's in the AIDS Memorial Grove in Golden Gate Park. And you can, again, go to my website for more information, and would love to have you. It'll be a beautiful working. So today, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Sarah Kerr. Drawing on the wisdom of nature-based spirituality, Sarah designs and facilitates ceremonies that help her clients and their families to integrate experiences of illness, death, and loss. These rituals honor the spiritual significance of what is happening and bring healing to the living and to the dying. Sarah's PhD dissertation explored the ways that modern Western people can restore and recreate meaningful rituals for the significant transitions of life. She has a master's degree in environmental philosophy, and she's been a student of spiritual and shamanic healing modalities since the year 2000. As a teacher and mentor to emerging death doulas, Sarah supports her students to find the unique healing gift that they carry and to make it available to their communities. And she facilitates private and public healing rituals, and she regularly presents on topics of death, midwifery, and holistic death care. And so more information on Dr. Sarah Kerr and her work is available on her website, which is soulpassages.ca, soulpassages.ca. So Sarah, welcome to Bespoken Bones.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here.
Yeah, it's such a treat for me to get to talk about this stuff with you.
Well, it's great.
You're a death doula. You work with death and the dying and their families. So I'd love to just start off with kind of an introduction to your work about this whole death thing. You know, each of us is ultimately going to die, right? And how do you feel like, or what's the most efficacious way that each of us should be preparing for this transition?
Well, big question, really important question. And, in my work with dying people and their families and with people dealing with unresolved deaths from the past, really my angle in on it is the soul's journey through loss and transition. And so that can mean lots of things depending on where you are in that process. For those of us who at this moment are lucky to be healthy and not feeling our death imminently, learning skills to navigate transition and all the smaller but yet transformative losses we go through in our life. If we learn the skills to do that, then when we go to meet our death, we're in better shape. So I guess that's, in terms of preparing, that's the first part, is to really get a taste for how loss happens and how to integrate it. And sometimes loss happens when something great happens. You get married, you lose the experience of being a single person. We have to say goodbye to that in order to step into the next phase. So that's a big part of it in terms of preparing, is just day by day, letting go of what was and being in what is, and not holding from too far back. And then in terms of my work more immediately, say with clients or families where death is really in the room, it's about, in a way, giving them a map for their soul, helping people understand what's happening and what the archetypal journey is through loss and transition, and the fact that the family and the dying person go through that together for some part of it, and then at some part they split. And the dying person continues on one journey and the family continues on another. And what are the ritual practices along the way that support that? Ritual is really my modality. In a way, I say I'm kind of like clergy for the unchurched, that people recognize this as part of their spiritual journey. They understand that some spiritual guidance and support around spiritual community is important, but they might not have a structure for it. So it's walking people through that path.
What I hear you saying is that there's really two parts to preparing for the death transition, and that the first part is around practice with transition. And the second part is preparation of a family and a dying person, kind of the archetypal journey that the soul makes in this transition. So I'm just wondering about the first piece, if you could speak a little bit more in terms of, like, what are those practices? Like, what are those transitory practices, or how can I be practicing death or practicing death transition in my day-to-day life?
It's really about recognizing, and this applies to both aspects of how you've named it, recognizing that things change in the outer world. We lose a job, we get married, we have a baby, we get a diagnosis. All those, life is just full of changes. It's always changing. Sometimes they're bigger. So these things change in the outer world. That's just the way nature and life happens in this dimension. Our soul doesn't by default necessarily catch up to that. And so we need practices, and they can be different, but they need to accomplish the same goal, which is a practice to assist our soul to catch up to the change that's happened. And we can probably see examples of this in lots of places in our lives, where someone we love has had a difficult experience. Maybe they had a divorce 20 years ago. They're divorced, but their soul never actually moved to the next stage. They're kind of still stuck in that pattern. So, or someone gets married, but they never really let go of the single person. They want to be where they are, but they still want to be where they were. So we need processes to move us to the next stage. And part of that is identifying the map, that we don't jump from A to B in one step. We actually move through a period of darkness and uncertainty, and we're not the first thing, and yet we haven't become the second thing, so we're in an in-between. So understanding it and giving ourselves time to say, well, the old's gone, and now I'm in this in-between, and honoring that. And ritual all the way along the way really are the practices that I use and help people with. And then at some point, then we can step into the new again. So it's honoring the timing. Simple ritual gestures can be part of it. And we do those around big rites of passage, say around marriage or the birth of a child, to name, oh, we're here and we're letting go of this and we're picking up this. And then the next point, we're here, we let go of what we had and we pick up the next. So ritual gestures can be a really important way of doing that, of just marking the move through those changes. So we get to the new place clean and ready to go, not dragging a bunch of rocks from the place we were before.
Yeah, thanks for going a little bit more deeply into that. I hear also a couple things in that. What you're saying is that there's especially the role of ritual, right? Mm-hmm. And the practice of being with what is, and also this practice of getting comfortable with uncertainty, right? And of being in the place, the in-between place. I love that you called it that. Tara Brach calls it that too, I think, of when we're in the in-between, when we're neither here nor there, and that's actually a really rich place to be. Yeah.
And that in-between place is really the cocoon. The caterpillar goes into the cocoon and dissolves. It isn't a butterfly yet, but it isn't a caterpillar anymore. And that cocoon, that period of some separation a little bit and containment in order to birth something new.
It's interesting that you use the word containment. Yeah. I mean, I just think somatically that, and ritually, right, of like what it is to have a container for those processes. It makes us like that, the container can become the certainty, right? Like we're certain we're in this ritual container. Like the caterpillar is certain, like, okay, I have this containment for this process to happen, even though the process is, it could be a terrifying process of letting go of everything that you've known to be true.
But it does. It gives us something to lean on when nothing else makes sense.
Exactly.
And we can't hold it for ourselves. We need something larger than ourselves because we're coming undone. Well, Starhawk says you need a pot to boil water in. And the alchemists talk about the alchemical vessel. So the act of ritual is the act of creating a process for transformation. So when a ritual works well, there are different kinds. There are maintenance rituals and transformative rituals, but let's say we're talking about transformative rituals. We go into the ritual as one person, we experience the ritual process, and we come out as someone different on the end. It's a pragmatic, transformative experience. It actually shifts the patterns in our energy body. And in order to do that, we do have to kind of be the caterpillar. We have to go in and come undone. We have to be completely able to release, let go, be vulnerable, be not in control, be not in our thinking mind, be not responsible for anybody or anything, and allow ourselves to be remade and then be supported out and through the other side. And so the container around us is held by other people. It may be held by one person, it may be held by a community. There are, for even personal rituals, it can be held by the repetitive nature of a ritual. That does something in the field. It can be held by the, who we invoke into it. But for any serious transformation, in my experience, we need somebody else. And that's where ritual is a community undertaking. We need somebody else to hold the space so that we can go inside and become undone.
Yeah, it's so interesting, this concept of becoming undone for the sake of a future greater iteration of ourselves, right? Is what you're talking about, and using a ritual container to do that. There's a lot of overlay here with trauma healing. Yeah.
And certainly in that coming undone, and that's the death and rebirth cycle. Like that's where ritual plugs into that bigger archetypal field.
Right. And so if I'm going to, like, if I actually want to heal my trauma and not pass it on, I have to have a container that can hold me. And I would actually extend your definition to include things like the natural world, like the elements for sure. Like sometimes we need a really big container. And that process of going into the thing for the sake of transforming it is, in fact, what I think I hear you saying is a practice of dying again and again so that we get good at what that practice is, so that when it comes time for our physical death, there's more smoothness, more grace, more ease, more something.
Yeah. More resonance in our system with what it feels like. We're not so afraid of letting something die because we've done it before. And in terms of the trauma approach, in a way you can look at the experience of having someone die in your family. It can be a traumatic experience. It's different varieties of trauma, but in the definition of trauma around the work of meaning and trauma is a kind of shattered assumption, a shattered world. If your world has been a certain way, with someone in it in a certain way, and suddenly they leave, your world is shattered. And all those things you've relied on, you have to rebuild yourself in a way to receive that. And so the rituals at each of those stages, the diagnosing the correct ritual for the stage is determining where someone is and what do they need to integrate where they are and just take a tiny step towards the next phase. And then we need to integrate that and then to the next and to the next. And that's how the regrowth and rebuilding happens.
I think what I hear you saying is that we're actually dying all the time,
Mm-hmm.
and that we can just put our attention on the fact that that's actually happening.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's true. Our cells are dying all the time. Like, we are experiencing death in our bodies every second of every moment that we're alive,
Mm-hmm.
right?
And we're never the person we were yesterday.
Yeah, that's so interesting. But we just don't put our attention on it, and we hold death far away somehow.
Right.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, I'm curious about, like, so let's talk about because we're kind of in the planning for death part of our conversation. I think about the resource of my ancestors and how amazing that's been, and for me personally in my healing, and I think for my family. And I have a commitment to wanting to be a good ancestor. And I wonder if there's anything, like, can we plan for that? And is there anything about planning for our death that helps us plan for that, and what your thoughts are about that?
I mean, I really hold strongly to a really relational model of self, that we are who we are in the context of who we are with and who we're in relationship with. And so, we understand through life, we go through a series of developmental stages, infant to child, to adolescent, young adult, we go all the way through these stages. We single, we get married, we have a job, we finish working, we move into elderhood. It doesn't happen like that for everybody, but in general, people move through those stages. And at each of those transitions, in a healthy culture, we should be marking those with a kind of rite of passage that helps us realize, oh, this old one is dying, now I'm moving to the new. And of course, there's lots of argument that in especially contemporary North American society, we have, for most people, missed the movement from adolescent to adult. And so we're a bit of an adolescent stuck society. So we need those transitions all the way through. And I would argue that the transition to ancestor is an equally important one. And that's what the rituals around a funeral and a death do. Now, they may happen at the end of elderhood, or they may happen at the end of toddlerhood. They don't necessarily fall in an order, but they're the community process which transforms not only the person who has died, but the relationship between the person who has died and the people who are still alive. So being a good ancestor is not something I personally, as a me, do. I mean, you could argue, yes, there's some ways I do, but in this conversation, it's not like me as an isolated being doing. It's how do we as a culture support all our dying ones to be well established on the other side in the field of the ancestors, in the village of the ancestors, so that we can be in right relationship with them and they can be in right relationship with us. So that kind of makes sense. It's stretching it a bit meta, but it's I hope it's clear.
Yeah, it totally makes sense. So I'm interested to your answer to that question. Like, how do we do that?
Well, I think it's recognizing to begin with that is a movement to a next stage of life, even though we don't happen to be alive in that stage. I think life encompasses death. So taking that as approach, and that's what I do with my clients, is help them visualize, if they're the dying person, what will be their role in community after their death. We, in many ways in this culture, we love to use the word lost. I lost my mother. Well, what a terrifying thing to think you'll be lost, to think you'll be gone from all relationship, just sort of some existential nothingness. So registering that actually, and continuing Bones grief therapy addresses this to some degree, that we need to find a new relationship for how we are with our ancestors. And that can be deeply ritual based, regular ritual practices, even for people who don't even maybe use that word. Bring them up at dinner once a week, or set a table for them, set a place at the table at Christmas for them. Just really simple ways. So we do it by pre-death, sort of opening up that possibility that they will still exist. They will still be part of the community. They will still be valued. And from wherever they are, they will have a role, and that we will connect with them and invite them to play a role, because really what we all want is purpose and identity and belonging. And death, I think, is so scary in this culture because we say it's the end of all of those things. But if we open up an ancestral view, we say, yes, you still have purpose, you still have identity, and you still belong. You're just doing it from the other side of the river.
It's interesting when I listened to you speak on this. I remember a dream I had back in 1995 after my grandmother died. And I was grieving, and I met her in my dream. And I said, what am I supposed to do with all this love? What's supposed to happen with that now that you're not on the other end of it? And she was so reassuring. She was like, oh, honey, the love is still there. It's just I'm over here. And I think that that's what you're saying, is that we can actually consider what our relationship to the living will be like after we've crossed over that the transition of death. And it's like almost like we can negotiate that with our loved ones, of like, how do you want this to be? What do we want this relationship to look like, even though it's going to look different, right?
And part of that is helping, while we're here, to build a culture that allows us to receive what the ancestors receive their relating. Because we can be ancestors on the other side wanting to relate all we want. If there's no reception here and there's no space for us to be engaged, we're not in control of that. So it's this, we can do whatever we do on the side we're on, but we need to do it in a relationship across that veil.
I hadn't even thought about the comfort that might be available if we frame it in this way. Kind of the loss of identity, the loss of belonging, like all that, like I lost my mother, you said, and the comfort that might be available if we started becoming more ancestrally relational. It is a great comfort to me, but I hadn't thought about it in terms of my own death. Like that's also, I thought about it like, oh, it's great to have ancestors and they're my support system, like that. But I hadn't thought about it going the other way of like, oh yeah, like I'm not going to be forgotten or lost.
Yeah. And I really, I feel like part of my work in this world is to help restore relationship between the seen and the unseen world. And the place I've landed to be doing this work, working with people who are facing an imminent death, is really an incredible chance to do it, because people who wouldn't at any other point in their life be willing to talk about this, and what might kind of, write off what I talk about or what I'm doing is a little bit far out there, suddenly when you're dying or the person you love is dying, and I can come and say, well, the goal of the funeral is to help get the dying person where they need to go. Suddenly people start nodding their heads because they think the dying person is going somewhere. So it opens a possibility for connection across the veil. When people are so raw and so close to loss, suddenly they're open to learning things they might not be open to if death wasn't in the room.
Yeah. Would you, in that same frame that you were talking about trauma earlier, is it also, because I think that trauma also does that, right? It gives us more access to the unseen realms, right? That's one of its blessings, right? There are also definitely burdens that go with that, like less discrimination or discernment, right? But there's a way that those states of being close to death or being in a shattered state give us access to the unseen. And I just wonder if there's any comfort there that you see in terms of that piece of trauma and death.
Well, certainly for someone who doesn't have support and validation for the unseen, it's a much more difficult process to go through, trauma or death. And so a lot of my work is giving people frameworks to be in relationship with the unseen. To either it's taking a bit of a transpersonal approach and giving them a bit of a crash course on near-death experiences and shared death experiences and after-death phenomena and deathbed awareness, like there's a bunch of acronyms in there about anecdotal, modern, scientific experiences of life after death. Or maybe it's giving them a more mythological archetypal map, but something that says the map is bigger than what we thought it was. The map that we worked with, which is that death is it, game over, lights go out, period, end of story, is a very difficult map to work with because there's no way to engage. There's nothing. We can't engage nothing. And there's never really nothing. There's always something, somehow. So giving them a way to move into something. And so I would imagine that the approach to trauma is very similar, that we give people a map that helps them understand their experiences in terms of this larger cosmology. It can be validating. Oh, that makes sense. That now I understand it. Now I can navigate in this bigger terrain.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I really am appreciating that framing of it. I'm wondering if you, and maybe this is too confidential, but I just wonder, like, I don't feel like I have any good role models for a good death. Like, what does a good death look like? And I know it's completely subjective, but I just wonder if you have any stories or, any stories that you might be able to share about beautiful deaths that you have seen as a way of offering a role modeling around that.
Yes, and I would be very careful to differentiate between a good death and a beautiful death. Those are not necessarily the same things. And to this, I refer back to the work of Stephen Jenkinson. And he says, the mark of a good death is that it's a village-making event. So what that says to me is there's so much about death we can't control. We can't control when it happens. We can't control how it happens. Are we in pain? Is it beautiful? Is it messy? Is it terrible? So all of those things are beyond our control. And as long as they're beyond our control, we can't rely on them or use them as factors in what we determine as a good death, because then our ability to have a good death is completely out of our control. So that's where it doesn't need to be beautiful to be good. If the mark of a good death is that it's a village-making event, what that says is we have agency, we have choice in how we can meet this death. And if we meet this death, whether it's expected and gradual or sudden and traumatic, if we meet it in a way that brings more love into the world, that helps everybody who's involved on this side of the river and the other, the ancestors, the living ones, the future ones, if we deepen relationship and deepen village connection between them, then a death can be difficult, but it can still be beautiful because we've found something larger than ourselves to rely on. And there is, in the end, it's not a mathematical undertaking, but in the end, there is more love because of it.
Do you have an example you could of something?
Yeah. I'll speak to one of my really early clients who was 67, and he had advanced thyroid cancer. He was a farmer, grass-fed, naturally raised beef farmer in southern Alberta here. And he and his wife had 4 young adult children, all of whom had been born with midwives, and they'd been deeply involved in the midwifery movement and supporting that when their children were born. And they really wanted to carry that into his death. So he had got the news that there was no more treatment available to him. He said, okay, thanks. It's been great. I'm going to go home and live. And he went home to this beautiful, warm nest of family. Lots of his kids came home to live for a few months. And he was really, really present and awake to it. And the first time I went to meet with him, the only time I actually met him alive, we were talking and he said something that just has been such a gift to me to share with other people. He said, I want my death to be the last great lesson I offer my children. And that framing changes everything, because it says even the dying person has purpose, that my death has value, and that I've been teaching my children how to live. Now I'm teaching them how to die. And so they all really approached it like that. And were deeply connected and open, and just, we did a bunch of ceremonies about, helping the love flow. What needs to be said? Who needs to really express? What kind of gratitude? What kind of love? And filling the space with that. And at his death, he died at home in the bed he'd been sharing with his wife all their lives, and in the house that he was born in, on this land that his parents had homesteaded. And the family gathered around him, and because we'd done some preparation work, they knew they didn't have to move his body quickly, and they stayed with him for a while, and then they washed his body. Really just beautiful, the tending of the body. If families are available for that, it's a beautiful gift and a ritual practice to help ease both the journey of the dead person, recently dead, just died person, and the living. And then it was probably 4 a.m. by the time they were done. And so he was lying on his side of the bed. His wife crawled into bed next to him. Their eldest daughter lay down beside her. and the cat jumped in the middle. And so they spent the night together. So again, this idea, your soul needs time to catch up. That whole period in the dark of the night while they tended his body and then slept with him was an adjusting period for the family. Very different than if suddenly after an hour or so, the funeral home comes and takes the body away. You're left with a bit of a vacuum. So we went on, there's a long story around the series of rituals we did with that, but all of them were about bringing people together and creating a container for him, for his next journey, that we were doing rituals for him, and we're also creating a container for that family to, in a sense, launch his canoe so that he began the journey across to the far shore.
Wow. It's moving to listen to that.
It's incredible to be part of it. Just incredible.
It also, it just speaks to this idea of, obviously there's such a disconnect with death in our culture. And it just speaks to this idea of how healing can move through generations, right? And I love the interplay of birth and death there. It's beautiful.
And, speaking about the generational aspect of it, when I am, he lived quite rurally, so I couldn't get there until the next day. But often when people die here in Calgary, I will, they die at 3 a.m, I get a phone call and I go off to the hospice and do a ceremony right then with their family. And, no matter how prepared a family is, and some of them are just so beautifully, beautifully ready, it doesn't matter. When someone core in the family dies, the whole family structure is shattered. And people, their faces get gray, their eyes get really big. And, when I hug them, I feel like I'm hugging a piece of spaghetti because their inner structures are just undone. Back to this being undone. And so they need a ritual at that point to just give them enough structure to be able to face the next moment. And so I do a bedside ritual after the person has died. And it's really a gift to them because they're standing in a space they don't know. The medical system is pretty much ready to let them go. The nurses say, do whatever you need to do. And when you're ready, let us know. We'll call a funeral home. But then there's a gap. And then the funeral home starts further on, and that's its own project. There's that in-between space where they really have no guidance. And so I come and we clean all the medical equipment out of the room. We open the window a crack. We make it beautiful. We gather around the bed. And the first thing we do is call the ancestors. So we go around the circle and people one by one name the people they know and love who've died, who are on the other side. And they're asking them to come down to the shore and be ready to meet this person, to receive them. And so it's a simple action, but it's ritually very profound. It calls the ancestors into space, very literally. It does that. I mean, I think in many ways they're already there. When the person's been in their dying time, the ancestors are aware of that. But it also, to each of the people speaking, reminds them at some unconscious level that this death is not the first they've seen. And that there are other people who have died and they have survived other deaths. And this death in front of them now seems unsurvivable, but they will survive it. And so the ancestors, by showing up and by bringing their presence into the room, we help people get a bigger perspective, a bigger map. Yes, this death is difficult, but there are other dead. And he's now going to join them. He's not lost. He's not disappearing into nothingness. He's moving to a new neighborhood that's hard to visit, but not completely out of connection.
Yes, that giving us that sense that there is that there's support available. There's transpersonal support available in these moments that that our structures all do collapse, right? Yeah, really similar to healing transgenerational trauma through ritual. I feel like very, very similar. This idea of the journey, right? You said that the soul is on this journey, that you've used the metaphor of river, getting to the other side of the river where the ancestors are. And so your cosmology about this is really that there's some kind of traveling thing. I mean, it's super common, I guess, in the mythos of death. But I just wonder if you would speak to kind of break that process down. What actually is happening?
Well, I cannot speak with complete certainty on this, but I, having not done it in my memory, my perspective on this is that there is some objective underlying reality. an energetic reality that is foundational. And it has to do with the process from being alive to being dead, I guess at its most fundamental. And that cultures and traditions and spiritual teachings all over the world approach that same reality, and they interpret it through their own cultural lenses in their own and come up with maps or images or understandings of what that process is. And there's a lot of similarity. They're not completely identical, but there's a lot of similarity between them. And the folks I work with tend to be, they identify themselves as spiritual but not religious. They're probably not as I'm further along some spectrum in terms of being involved in these practices than many of my clients are. They're often just living lives and haven't really thought a lot about these things until this happens. And so what I have found is really helpful is offering a framework that translates that underlying reality for them that's sort of acceptable for this frame and culture. I just did a long interview the other day with a woman who's a Kundalini yoga practitioner. There's a huge wisdom there about the process of the soul and how it unwinds and which ethereal and which astral body go here and go there. And it's got the whole map, and it's not different from a lot of other maps. But for many of my clients, that map is alienating because the language of Kundalini yoga isn't theirs. So the map I use is one that I sort of put together from a bunch of different places. Some of the roots go back again to Stephen Jenkinson, some go to Martine Prechtel, some are just generally from the myths around the world about this. But the map I offer is this understanding that when we die, we find ourselves on the shore of a river. And it's a really wide river and it's gentle. Most of the time it's covered in fog. But that mist, that fog lifts when someone arrives there. So we find ourselves on the shore, and the beach is sandy, and there are footprints there. And the footprints are the footprints of people we love who've died before us. They're our ancestors. But they're not on this side of the river anymore. They're on the far side of the river. And they need a little bit of help to get to that far side of the river. And they get that help from 3 different places. Those of us on this side of the river build them a canoe. And we build that canoe out of love. And it's an energetic canoe because we're not in the physical realm anymore. We're in the energetic realm. And this relates back to our conversation about container, right? We're building them a container to be able to make the journey through this uncertain period to reach the far shore. We build a canoe out of love, and that canoe is fueled by our grief. And of course, that's why paddles are shaped like tears. So our grief is actually a gift we give to this process, and it serves the one we love who's died. So we built that canoe. We kind of fill the paddles with tears, with grief. But on the other side of the river, there's also preparation happening there. When someone enters their dying time, whether we are consciously aware of it on this side or not, the ancestors know. And they start to come down to the shore. They start to come down to the shore to welcome the same way we're on this shore getting ready to say goodbye. And the rituals around death that happen on this shore mirror rituals that happen on that shore. And a really big one is the funeral. And so at a funeral, and a funeral is, again, a transformative, pragmatic ritual designed to change things. And it's designed really to launch the canoe, to send it off from the shore, for people here to have that experience of consciously releasing the person. So our grief carries it exactly halfway out into the river. And the ancestors who are on the other side, also doing ceremony, reach out, and their love and their joy carries it the other half of the way home. And so we grieve on this side, and there's this huge celebration on that side. That's the second place people get support from. And then the third is from, you could call them the angels of death. Sometimes they're called the psychopomp beings. They're the spirit beings who know the way. And so they pilot the canoe, making sure it gets where it goes. So dying is not exactly a solitary journey. It's, again, a relational community process. And that I find that map is useful because it gives people a way to connect with what's happening. And then the way that ritual flows from myth that map then gives us an instruction manual for what rituals we need to do at what point in order to help people along that journey. So that's a mythical approach to it. And as I say, there's a kind of a transpersonal psychology approach, but the mythical one I find is very useful.
Yeah, it's really helpful. Because I think about it in terms of like, well, yeah, like when a baby is coming here, when a soul is coming here, all the excitement that we have, right?
Yeah.
I'm imagining that it's like this river, things go both ways, right?
Well, and my ancestry is Celtic, and in the Celtic tradition, the stork is the bird that brings the baby from across the water. So yeah, I definitely see it as a circle. And, occasionally I do rituals to support people in abortions. And in that situation, the baby's coming across the river. We have to catch the canoe and turn it around and send it back again. So it's the same aspect of the journey.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. I'm just wondering if there's anything else that feels important to you to speak to in this interview.
We've covered lots. There's lots of other ways to go with some of this. I guess really for me, the deepest healing is coming to recognize that death is natural, is normal, and is actually, we need it. If we didn't have death, we wouldn't have lots of other things that we need. Each death makes way for another birth. And, it's a great line from Bob Dylan. He says, people who suffer together have stronger connections than people who are most content. And I think in a way, the dying process may be an opportunity for communities to get closer, that it become a village-making event. It's kind of a reboot of love for each other and connection. And each death sort of reopens the portal between this world and the ancestors. And we remember all our ancestors and all our other dead when someone we love dies. So the death is hard, it's sad, but it's not wrong. And it really actually brings enormous gifts.
Sarah, thank you so much for the guidance and wisdom that you offered today. It's been such a pleasure to have you here on Bespoken Bones.
You're welcome. I've really enjoyed it.
Yeah. So for more information about Sarah Kerr and her work, I really invite my listeners to check out your website, which is soulpassages.ca. Thanks, folks, for listening to this episode. And if you feel inspired by what you heard, I would love to hear from you. And you can go to my website, which is trancestralhealing.com, and you can learn more there about the sexual and ancestral wellness work that I'm offering, as well as the new class about queer and trans ancestors. And just also wanting to say, I've been getting a lot of messages from folks saying how much the podcast is meaning to them. And that's really delightful and nourishing to me. So thank you if you've taken a moment out of your life to just send some feedback or support. It really means the world to me to hear from you. I'm Pavini Moray, and I will be back every full and new moon with more embodied goodness and ancestral wisdom. Blessings on you and on your ancestors.